This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I had a guy the other day email me after an episode of this podcast came out. And that episode had nothing to do with trading, like a lot of my episodes have nothing to do with trading. This episode had something to do with Indonesia, the CIA, and all kinds of funny business that went on in the 1960s. Terribly interesting to me, a really cool story, a great author. So somebody writes me after that episode to say, what does that have to do with trading and investing? And I said, look, my podcast is at 900 episodes, almost. Trading, investing, economics, Nobel Prize winners, best-selling authors, psychologists, philosophy, political science, you name it. It's all there. And I could not help but call him a moron as well. Now, I know it's not nice to call someone a moron, and I did not go looking for this guy. Now, of course, he responded because nobody wants to be called a moron, again, even if they are one. And he told me that he will no longer listen to this podcast. He wrote me back to tell me that. My God, how fragile has society become? Does this clown really think I care? I would do this podcast if no one listened, because I get to learn. I get to ask questions of smart people. That's fun for me. So if you want to listen, great. If you don't want to listen, great. It's all good by me. But today, however, I am reaching back in time to give you a little bit of a trend-following fire hose to the mouth. Campbell Harvey, an academic, a trend-following academic. Mark Sleeman, a trend-following trader. And Brian Proctor, an original turtle trader. Without any further delay, because you got a little bit of listening on this particular episode, let's jump right in. Campbell Harvey, Mark Sleeman, and Brian Proctor. I have a sneaky suspicion that a lot of you are going to really like this particular conversation. My guest today is Campbell Harvey, Canadian economist known for his work on asset allocation with changing risk and risk premiums and emerging markets finance. He's a professor at Duke University as well as a research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research in Massachusetts. For those of you that love the conversation of the bell curve and skew and risk and volatility, Campbell is extremely proficient at really good explanations. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Campbell Harvey. So listen, let me break this apart with you. You've got this interesting paper that I've come to be aware of called Evaluating Trading Strategies. And I want to kind of unpack how that started. And before we get into the trading aspect of that, I wonder if you could use the example that goes into football first and just kind of like let the audience slowly come into this thinking.
Right. So there are plenty of sports examples here too. And maybe football is one of them, where like a team could have many wins in a row, or a quarterback many passes in a row. And the issue is that due to skill, or is it luck, or is it a combination? It's also the case that the quarterback could appear to do quite poorly in not making that many passes. That doesn't necessarily mean that the quarterback lacks skill. It could just be bad luck. Again, if you're evaluating in real time whether to pull the athlete or not, this needs to be taken into account. It is the same thing with investment managers, where you can you can outperform the market many, many years in a row. It's not clear that that's a result of skill or a result of just good luck. And it is a vexing problem in finance. How do we separate the skill from the luck?
Before we get into your paper and the example that you have in particular about a particular trading firm, their strategy, I was just thinking as you were talking about beating the market for many years in a row, I'm quite fond of him. He's like some of my work. I've had a chance to meet him several times. He had a fantastic run at Legg Mason, and that's Bill Miller. I think he beat the S&P for 14 years in a row, I believe. But then at the end of the 14-year stretch, there was a pretty significant drawdown in the '08 crisis. So I think this, as you make this point about skill versus luck, there's no doubt it's not an easy subject, is it?
No, and look, it can be a combination. That's the thing. It's really interesting if you group the best performing hedge funds or mutual funds and then hold those for the next period and just keep on doing that. So you just buy the winners, like the extreme winners. You just have that as a strategy. Then what you find is that portfolio does poorly. Some of this is just luck, that the people at the very top probably were blessed with good luck. That doesn't mean that they're unskilled. They could still be skilled. Yeah. But they were skilled plus the luck that got them up there. And this is the way that I usually like to explain this. And suppose that you just like grab a whole bunch of dice, like a large number, let's say 36 dice, and you drop them on the table. And then you go pick out all of the ones that show 6. And let's say there's about 7 of them, and take all the other dice away off the table. Then you drop the ones that all have 6. And you're going to get a combination of 1, 2, 3. It's going to average of about 3. And think of that as the people that did really well. The 6s are the people that were at the very top, that did the best. And then when you throw those dice again, it's just natural that you're not going to get 7 6s from those dice. So a lot of this has to do with regression to the mean and luck.
You know, I was thinking of 2 very famed investors, traders. One very famous, one not so famous, but just as successful. Jim Simons at Renaissance Technologies. I mean, he's had math formulas named after him. He will come out loudly and clearly always say, hey, I'm a very lucky guy. That's not, as you just say, that's not taking away from his skill. And I can think of the most famous USA investor, the wealthiest USA investor. He also says, he says, look, I won the ovarian lottery. I mean, that's Warren Buffett. So there's clearly a piece of luck at play. And I think as we start to talk about, as we start to move into your paper, the notion of survivorship bias really starts to become an interesting topic, because, you know, if we are to look at particular trading strategies or particular traders, I always say to myself, and not in any way to take anything away from Warren Buffett, but there's not a lot of other Warren Buffetts.
That's true. And I think that Jim Simons, Warren Buffett are probably
they're up there.
they are up there, and they are saying, "Well, I was lucky." I really that's a hard one to believe. I know Jim Simons. I don't know Warren Buffett. They do very different things. From what I know of Simon's operations, there's a lot of skill there, but as you say, it can be a combination of having skill and good luck.
Well, you got to have a strategy. You got to have a strategy that's predicated. I'm thinking maybe for both of them, perhaps you have a strategy that puts you in a position to benefit, which I think is a skill to think this through, puts you in a position to benefit when the unexpected happens. If one has a strategy that can operate like that, that starts to be skill-like.
Yes, no, definitely. And again, it might not always work.
Sure, process versus outcome. You could have a great process and it doesn't necessarily mean that outcomes could be beautiful every time, right?
That is correct. And you mentioned survivorship bias, that the people, the winners are the ones that survive. There is a kind of reverse type of bias, and that is that some very skilled investment managers drop out because they've had bad luck. That's kind of a reverse survivorship bias. But this is really important, that this idea doesn't just apply to investment managers. Just let me discuss just for a minute another research paper I have that does a psychometric survey of CEOs. What my paper finds is that CEOs are hugely more tolerant of risk than the lay population, like by a factor of 10. It's extraordinary. And you can think of a scenario where these people that are very tolerant of risk enter a firm as a junior employee. They take a lot of risk, and some of them they get lucky, it turns out. Others, they don't get lucky and they drop out of the firm. And then these people that are taking a lot of risk with enough luck will rise to the top and be the CEO. Whereas the person that's risk averse never takes that extra bit of risk, never experiences the good luck, and is stuck in the middle of the firm. So this explains why the CEOs happen to be very tolerant of risk. The interplay of that plus luck, I think, goes a long way to explain kind of the kind of psychometric qualities of CEOs.
I can think of two very famed investors, heads of investment banks, who I think until the fall of 2008 were just, for the vast population out there that understood what they did, they were viewed as Prince Charming. Nothing could go wrong. I mean, Ace Greenberg at Bear Stearns and Dick Fuld at Lehman Brothers. I mean, these were guys that I think would fit right into the outline that you were describing. But then on the backside of an entire career of taking more risk, waking up one day and the dice come up different, huh?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, risk is two-sided. So there's an upside and a downside. And this was obviously a negative realization. It's really hard because they were on a roll, so to speak. This could be bad luck, or it could be lack of skill.
As we were talking about the survivorship bias issue, and we're going to probably talk about that multiple times today, but I was thinking, you said, well, it could have been very successful investors, and then they drop out after a long, like the two I just mentioned, a long string of success, and then boom, they drop out because of. I sometimes think, though, that as another side of that coin, I often see that we'll talk about successful investors, and then we'll say, well, survivorship bias, they're the lucky ones left. What about all the other guys that failed? The implication being that everyone that failed was as skilled and had the same technique or same strategy as those winners, which I think sometimes that's not, I don't necessarily see that evidence all the time. I think sometimes we just assume they were equal, but they're not necessarily equal or taking the same steps or strategies. Just another facet of this, right?
Yeah, totally agree. It could be a much different strategy. But like in the end, that's what they choose. So you could think of every investor having a slightly different strategy. Some of them might be chasing real risk premia. Some of them think that they're chasing real risk premia, but it turns out that it's not. Others are chasing mispricing in the market that might be fleeting. Indeed, it might turn the other way, that once you start buying, all of a sudden, instead of something being undervalued, it's overvalued. So there's just a myriad of different strategies out there, and some of them will turn out because they should turn out, like capturing a long-term risk premium, and some of them will turn out just by luck.
You're just excited in terms of your research. Was it random?
That's correct. So I think that we don't do a very good job at basically questioning the performance and basically saying, was this due to luck or was it due to skill on both sides? So this is very important. So we look at these investment manager stars and think that they've got a huge amount of skill, and we don't consider the other side. How much of that is luck? As I said, goes both ways, where, and you know how often this happens, where you hire an investment manager. You look at the track record. It's a wonderful track record. You're comfortable with the track record. You invest with the manager, and then they have like 1 or 2 years of subpar performance, and then you fire them. And as soon as you fire them, the next year they do great. Well, what's the story there? Well, it's a simple story of just like I mentioned with the dice. You have a couple of years of bad luck. Indeed, in the track record, there's probably a couple of years like that too. But you tend to ignore that. You fire the person at exactly the wrong time and you pay the price. So investors just don't do a very good job of attempting to weigh the balance of luck and skill.
Okay, before we get into your paper, I want you to put your professor hat on for a moment. And I think one of the reasons that perhaps so many people get confused is that we want to think in terms of this nice normal distribution, because it works great for weights and heights and all this kind of stuff. And it's just fantastic. Everything's just normally distributed. But in the real world of asset management and trading and investing, there's something called skew. Why don't I let you run with it here for a few minutes as you're opening up to the class for the first time to try and unpack a little bit of this wrong thinking about the normal distribution and what skew is exactly.
Sure. And this is an important component of my own research. There's a path-breaking paper published in 1952 by Harry Markowitz on how to kind of optimize a portfolio. That paper led to a Nobel Prize for him in 1990. And basically what this paper does is it says, well, what we want is a portfolio with the best possible target return, but the lowest volatility for that level of target return. Essentially, this is the optimal trade-off of expected return and risk. And I'd like to put risk in quotations because in this path-breaking paper, there's a footnote that's buried at the end of the paper that basically says, this only is appropriate if the asset returns are normal and investors have no preference for skew. So let me explain what that actually means. If the asset returns are so-called normally distributed, then there's no unusual tail behavior. That means that there's no severe downside. There's no severe upside. The upside and the downside are exactly symmetric. The usual measure of volatility, that's exactly what happens. That, for example, you could have a stock that is going up dramatically. Maybe it goes up like 300, 400%, and it's got a high level of volatility. And you can have another stock that goes down dramatically, maybe goes down 95%, and it's got the exact same level of volatility. Volatility doesn't tell you anything about the direction. It's measuring the surprises in an absolute sense. So volatility is symmetric. It treats the upside and the downside the same. Skew, on the other hand, tells us the balance between the upside and the downside. So you could have two portfolios that have the same target return, that have the same volatility, but they've got a different skew. So one has got an abnormally high probability of a severe downside. The other has got an abnormally high probability of severe upside. So for any investor, it's obvious which one to choose. You choose the one that has got more upside than downside. I've been on a campaign for many years to try to change the way that we think of risk, change the way that we actually do asset management or portfolio management, to take this asymmetry between the upside and the downside, to recognize that it is rare that any asset return is so-called normally distributed, and actually make that part of the portfolio management exercise, and equally as important, make it part of the risk management exercise. I am tired about hearing about these 20 standard deviation events, like what happened to the Swiss franc, or and there's many other during the financial crisis, the Russian crisis, all this stuff. 20 standard deviation events. It's not 20 standard deviations. It's only 20 if you believe naively that these asset returns are normally distributed. They're not. So don't even tell me this. It doesn't make any sense.
I've had Harry on my show. I had a chance to meet him before. He's a really neat guy. He's still sharp as a tack. I think he would make the argument, and I think he has, that like, okay, I did my paper, and this was, I don't want to use the word exercise, but that's what's coming to my mind right now. I think he was surprised at how the industry took his work, and he really wasn't a part of what happened, but they kind of took his work and ran with it. And that was essentially how modern finance got built off the back of his work, isn't it? That's a fair brief synopsis, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I was at a conference with him 3 weeks ago. It is that 1952 paper is an amazing paper. I've only mentioned one thing that he foresaw. There's another important one also. Yeah, I think that this was like a simple framework that he proposed. It works under special assumptions. He was the one that recognized what those assumptions were, but then you're right, the industry just goes with something and doesn't think about, like, when is it appropriate to apply and when isn't it? When I teach finance at Duke University, it's one of the main lessons for my students is, okay, we've got these models. All these models are wrong. That's why they're called a model. You're simplifying reality. And the issue of applying your skill is knowing when to apply a simplified framework and when not to. In certain situations, it's fine. Other situations, no. So I think that Harry is really the father of modern finance, and that paper is just an incredible piece of work, given that he saw not just the usefulness of his simplified framework, but he saw basically how to take it to the next level and to incorporate this idea of skew.
Let's jump into, as I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, your paper, Evaluating Trading Strategies. And it did catch my eye for one thing in particular, which is your early example. And I want you to explain how you selected this. And I want to make sure that, I assume that I knew the advisor that you were talking about, which was AHL, which is a managed futures trading operation owned by Mann out of London. That was the example, right?
Yeah. So let me describe the example, and it's from a seminar at Mann AHL, who, as you say, is a managed futures house that manages about $15 billion. So at AHL, they look at strategies all the time. They think very deeply about this luck versus skill. This is a strategy that basically they showed a cumulative profit from 2004 through 2014. It's a graph, and it's basically going straight up. It's extraordinary strategy where it's got 1 year that has a very small negative return in 2004. It knocks the ball out of the park during the financial crisis. It's got about a 15% annualized return, 15% volatility. So a so-called Sharpe ratio of 1, extremely consistent. We're looking at this strategy, and you can see people's head nodding. Yes, this is the sort of thing we want to put some capital on. And then the very next slide is really surprising. It adds to this graph the other 199 purely random strategies. So all of a sudden, this graph that was just one line going straight up is added 199 things that basically are centered around zero. The exercise was to simulate 200 random strategies with a target return of 0. So every single one has no skill, has purely generated numbers and a 15% volatility. And you see the very top one, the very best one, is the one that was shown first. And then you see at the bottom, there's like a terrible one that earns 15% negative, and everything in between. And the idea is that just by pure random chance, and that's what the random number generator is doing, by random chance, you're going to see strategies that look great. You need to be very careful in a company. If you're doing internal research, what you don't want is your researchers sifting through hundreds of strategies and just picking off the top one. Because when you put money on that top one in real time, it's going to do poorly.
Now, this was AHL presenting this information. You were at an event.
Yeah, because again, they're leading edge in terms of thinking about luck versus skill, and this was part of an exercise on how to avoid overfitting of back tests. So that's why that exhibit is there, because it is a great example that you could easily be fooled by random strategies.
What is your perspective, just as a kind of little interjection here, what is your perspective, your thoughts about the work of Nassim Taleb, the black swan thinking?
Oh, well, it fits in really well with my work on skewness. He talks about so-called black swan events. And again, these events that are like negative 20 standard deviation events, it doesn't make any sense unless it's a normal distribution. Because within a normal distribution, the probability of something like that happening is like one event in the life of the universe, which doesn't make any sense. So he's talking about these things that are basically not, you don't necessarily see them in historical data, but then they happen. A so-called negative, you could think of it as an extreme negative skew type of event. So that works in really well because his view of the world, as my view of the world, is that it's not symmetrically distributed. It's not normally distributed. So I think that that's important.
Coming back to the point you were making a second ago, though, I think when you have researchers, you have someone who massive, I use a third party example, TradeStation software, and people start inventing strategies. Most of the top traders that I've talked to, and I was looking at AHL, I've had a chance to talk to the H and the L in AHL. But I was thinking that you really need to have an economic thought process as to why this particular strategy might work. So, for example, if we were talking managed futures, we've been talking skew. Many of the managed futures trading strategies obviously are trend following in nature, and they're predicated on not really knowing what's going to happen next. A lot of their risk premium comes from hedging. I mean, other hedgers out there. I mean, people can make arguments about where their source of profits come from. But I mean, there's a thinking, a long-standing thinking that goes behind this particular strategy. And I think you're making the point that, hey, if you just sit down at your computer and you really have not even philosophically thought through what the strategy is, and then you only want to trust some random systems that come up and there's really not a thought process behind those systems, you can wake up in some trouble. Even if initially all your investors are sold on the idea of 15% returns and 15% volatility, and that sounds great, and you raise $1 billion, but if there's not a sound economic thinking behind what the strategy is, we all know what's going to happen.
That's correct. So this is the way that it should work. And I do know from direct experience, this is the way that it does work at a firm like Man AHL. And maybe it's no surprise that they've done so well with this. So basically, a researcher would come up with an idea, but without looking at the data. So they come up with an economic framework. And then they actually pitch that framework in a seminar. I'll call it that. It's like an academic seminar. They will get feedback, and then the senior people will actually decide whether the economic idea makes enough sense that they actually go to the data. Let's say it does make sense, then the firm will give the researcher what's known as a random partition of the history of the data. So they will give bits and pieces of the history to the researcher. The researcher will then test the economic idea, and this is the so-called in-sample testing. And then there'll be another seminar. The results will be presented of this exercise, and then a decision will be made whether to give the rest of the data to test it in the so-called out-of-sample. So it might be killed, or it might go ahead to the out-of-sample. So let's say it actually goes to the out-of-sample, and let's say it does well. Then there's a further stage where it will be invested in, but only invested with internal money. So it's multiple stages that you actually have to go through until it gets to client, because you really don't want to put anything to client trading that might be a result of luck, because you don't want to disappoint your clients. All the incentives are running the right direction to do the best possible thing for your client.
I want to go into a couple other issues as we wind down. I was giving a presentation in Singapore this spring, and I was speaking about the managed futures trading strategy of trend following. And at the end of the presentation, this young lady raised her hand, and she just had this look that said she probably had been at Duke in one of your classes and really, really was bright. You know, she just had that look that said, oh man, I'm in trouble. She's going to kill me. She's going to obliterate me. I'm dead. And she raises her hand, and she immediately shot herself in the foot. And I want you to kind of explain why. But she immediately was like, okay, can you tell me about the Sharpe ratio of these strategies? And I wanted to do a Vulcan mind meld and just say, hold on, don't just immediately assume the Sharpe ratio is the be all end all. Let's at least pick apart the pros and cons of the Sharpe ratio. But you could just see the indoctrination as she asked the question.
Yeah, incredibly naive, but this is the way it is in industry, and like on both sides, buy side, sell side, that people will look at an investment, look at the Sharpe ratio, which is the expected excess return, usually over some benchmark, divided by the volatility. So they are only considering the volatility risk. And let me tell you the type of trouble that gets you into. If you do like the Sharpe ratios of different investment styles, or maybe even like hedge fund returns, you'll see a wide variation in the average Sharpe ratios. You'll see gigantic Sharpe ratios for things like convertible arbitrage, but more modest Sharpe ratios for things like managed futures. And the reason is very clear once you expand the way you think about risk. Managed futures has got positive skew. And it's almost by construction, because when things are going up, you're buying. That's the same as replicating a long call option. When things are going down, you're selling. That's like replicating a long put option. So effectively, you can think of managed futures as something with a long straddle performance, which has got positive skew. So they do really well in market meltdowns, and they do well when the market's going up sharply. So that is something that is rewarded by investors. They actually like that. It provides a hedge. Whereas these other very high Sharpe ratio strategies, they can have severe negative skew. So for them, you need to have some extra return on average because investors really don't like that severe downside. So you cannot compare two strategies based upon a Sharpe ratio if they have different skew properties. The Sharpe ratio does not take that into account. Indeed, it's very similar to what we were talking about earlier with the simple Markowitz framework, where you look at expected target return divided by volatility. Volatility is not a sufficient metric for risk. It is part of the story. It's not the entire story. If you make the mistake of just looking at volatility, then it's going to lead to a portfolio that will disappoint you.
I was thinking back to that example I just mentioned with the young lady. And the moment I started to try to unpack the conversation, the Sharpe ratio, and talking about upside volatility, the blinders went on. It was just like, don't say anything else. I didn't know if it was I didn't want to listen, or I don't understand, or I've already got my mind made up. It was just, the indoctrination just strikes me.
Well, it's complicated because this sort of discussion is not even in the textbooks in finance. It's kind of surprising. So you can go through a top program.
That is a truest statement. Anyone listening right now that doubts you, I want them to go find where you're wrong.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I don't use the textbook for what I teach. I teach out of my own notes and my own research articles. But this is something that you have to point a lot of fingers here, including pointing fingers at my own colleagues. So I just don't think that we do a good job of explaining risk to our students. I think in my classes, about 3 classes, we just sit down and just think about what risk actually is.
That's such a great, you're making an absolutely fantastic point there. And I'm thinking this as we're talking, it's the put aside all the jargon and to get people to conceptually wrap their arms around the idea of what skew is. And even getting rid of the word skew, so to speak, and getting people to sit down and look at it all and really just, I think a freshman in high school with no math training, if properly explained what's going on, could understand this.
Yeah, no, I agree. Let me give the other insight in Markowitz's article that is relevant for this discussion. And that is that his framework assumes that you exactly know all of the inputs. You exactly know the volatilities. You exactly know correlations between assets, and you exactly know the target return. Exactly. There's no uncertainty in any of the inputs. Whereas in the practice of management, there is uncertainty. So another dimension of risk is that you think the correlation is, let's say, 0.5, but you're not sure. Maybe it's 0.2, maybe it's 0.7, but it's certainly not exactly 0.5. The same for the volatility. You think it's 15, but you're uncertain. Maybe it's 12. Maybe it's 17. This is another dimension of risk. So most people think, well, risk is just the volatility. Well, another way of thinking about risk is, well, what if you don't know what the volatility is? Well, even deeper, what if you don't know the distribution? So it's not normal. We kind of know that, but what is it? So, or the skew. We don't know what that downside tail actually is. We can maybe estimate it, but we're not sure. All of this is risk, and it's rarely taken into account at this level, that there's a difference between risk and uncertainty. People usually group those together, and it shows that they really haven't thought it through.
I think one last point to kind of end on as we talk about the notion of estimates and so many of the decision makers out there that are in charge of institutional money or making allocations. I mean, it'd be a long story to get to the point as to why many of them have maybe a faulty foundation. But the fact that so many decision makers that are in charge of other people's money think that somehow or another there is a perfect prediction for tomorrow, and that estimates are a bad thing when estimates are basically all we got. It's really crazy as that we've got to a position where there's so many people that think the world of investment management is supposed to be perfection. It's just an insane notion that we've got ourselves to this day and age.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the actual investors kind of reinforce this because they will judge the manager based upon the past quarter or the past year. And that leads to a different type of behavior on the part of the manager. I would much prefer, as I said earlier, take a look at the track record. You're comfortable with it, fine. And what I actually recommend that investors do, and the investment managers, is to educate the client as to what could happen. So one way of doing that is really simple. Let's say I've got a 20-year track record. What I can do is to create, with the real data from those 20 years, an alternative history by kind of randomly sampling years and put them together. And then just keep on doing that. Then it gives you a way to look at what things could look like given the track record. So then when it actually happens, maybe you've got 2 years in a row of substandard performance, you can look at the history and say, well, gee, that's not unusual. That happens 25% of the time, given the track record. So if you believe the actual track record and you actually analyze it in this way of creating alternative histories, then it really helps you avoid the mistake of firing a skilled manager, basically because they've had some bad luck.
If I see 1% a month, every year, I'm either thinking it's Bernie Madoff Jr. or another long-term capital management. You just can't make money every month. I mean, maybe there's somebody with a high-frequency shop that's got some insane advantage that no one else has, but it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, this is a great example of actually one of my exam questions was almost exactly this. So you've got somebody that is basically an S&P 500 portfolio, but on top of the S&P 500, they're writing out-of-the-money put options and out-of-the-money call options. If there's not that much volatility, you're collecting a premium. Month after month, given that premium that you're collecting, they beat the market. 1% here, 2%, 1%, 2%. It just keeps on going. It's a legitimate strategy. It is foolish to think that is beating the market or alpha or whatever you want to call it. That's called taking risk, because if the market goes severely down, then you've got these put options you have to pay off. It magnifies the downside of holding the S&P 500. And on top of that, it cuts off the upside, because if the market goes up substantially, you need to pay out for the call options. So all that does is to take a portfolio, the S&P 500, and tilt it towards negative skew. And that's the reason that you see a return pattern like this, that people are getting a little extra return because at some point there's going to be a severe downside. So I think that is important to take into account.
It's cliche, but that free lunch thing really isn't so free. So, hey, Campbell, listen, I appreciate you coming on today, and I hope you enjoyed the time. I really think people are going to like this episode. You are a pro's pro in terms of interviewees, so I appreciate you coming on. Where can we send people to check you out, more of your work? Where's the best place for them to go? I know you got a Wikipedia page up, which probably leads to everything, but you fire out the URL.
You could go at Cam Harvey on Twitter. that would, and my blog is called Garden of Econ altogether.
I hope you come on again. I'm going to have to start checking out your papers. It's a difficult subject, but to break this down, and maybe I'm too far in the clouds too these days, I don't know, but to break it down and try and get these subjects unfiltered and to make sense is a challenge. My guest today is Mark Sleeman of MS Capital Management. Mark has been trading since the late 1980s. He's a self-taught trend-following trader, but he has also been wise enough to reach out to mentors along the way, David Drews, Ed Seykota. A classic trend-following conversation I hope you enjoy. My first question I have to ask, before being introduced, have we crossed paths somewhere, online, somewhere? I just feel like we have, or is it, this is our first time crossing paths?
This is our first time. I've certainly heard of you and got some of your books, but I don't think we've ever talked or corresponded apart from the last couple of days.
Okay. I was just curious. And I tell you, I'm in Asia. I'm not used to having somebody in front of me. No, you're 5 hours in front of me. You've got to be close to the date line, if not on it.
We're in front of just about everyone, I think. But yeah, people sometimes find it hard to grasp, especially when they're in the US and they're behind everyone.
Oh, so listen, today I'm going to cover a lot of territory. You've got a lot of different insights you can give my audience. I'm sure about that. But I think one of the first things that would be great to jump into, so here you are, you're a systematic guy, a quant guy, you're trading trend following type systems. When was the first moment? I know your trading goes back to the early 90s. I know you started trading for clients in 97. But what was that first moment where you saw just the idea of a systematic trend following system could work? I mean, you're probably like most of us, we see the fundamental trading, the Warren Buffett. What was the trigger, that first moment where you said, there's something else out there?
Yeah, I don't think I ever started from a fundamental viewpoint. I just started from a viewpoint of making money. And I think when I first started I opened my first futures trading account way back in 1988, and I lost money straight away, which was actually a really good thing. I didn't think so at the time. And I was really searching for some way of making money. And I was actually in Sydney, Australia on holiday, and I popped into a bookstore downtown and always liked to look at the financial books, and I saw a book by a guy called Stanley Kroll. I don't even know if I can remember the name of the book now. I've got it in my bookcase here somewhere. And he was trading systems way back in the 70s. That's where I got the idea, really.
So it was literally just that first book. I mean, you have an engineering background, so you have no problem with the idea of a, quote, system. So it was that first book, and that was the trigger. Now, were you on your own at that moment where it was like, okay, I'm just going to go back into my lair, so to speak, and research and execute and create? Or was there other people you were talking to, a mentor? What was happening at that time?
Actually, I've just got the book off my bookcase, so I'm talking to you. It's called Kroll on Futures Trading Strategy by Stanley Kroll. Tremendously clear thinker, this guy, and not many people have heard of him. I don't think. Maybe.
I've heard the name, but I've not read the book.
I think he's deceased. I think he died maybe 10 years ago. I started on my own with that. I wasn't actually a systematic trader still, but I was using those principles on a discretionary basis. And really, the difference between discretionary trading and systematic trading at that level is not that great. In fact, it's a system that's just automating the same process.
But were there any early on or even later on, were there any mentors, anybody that came into your life that helped you to take your process a step further?
New Zealand's a small country, and the futures business in New Zealand is smaller than small. And I was trading at the local commission house, and they put me onto a guy who had just basically gone professional. His name is Robert Holroyd, and he, amazingly enough, it was really being mentored by David Drews and Ed Seykota. So it's a tiny, tiny world. very sadly, Robert's actually dead now. He was a great guy, and he was really the pioneer in this country, and he certainly helped me.
Let me pick on one phrasing that you've used a couple times in our conversation so far today. You've said futures trading, and I sometimes like to pick the bone to say, I mean, are you really a futures trader, or are you a trend following trader who happens to trade futures?
I think to this point, I've been a trend following futures trader. I'm certainly looking harder at equities, if that's what you mean by the question.
Well, I guess sometimes, someone asked me the other day, they said, hey, Mike, where do I, as a new person, and they said, where do I start trading stocks? And I wanted them to think about the idea of, don't focus on the market, don't focus on the instrument per se, but think about what your strategy is going to be. And so I guess when you say futures trading, to some degree, I think it downplays what you really do. Does that make sense?
Yes. So yes, I run a system on markets, and they happen to be futures markets. Is that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you think I'm picking a fine point here, but I think sometimes people get they hear commodities, for example, and you trade a lot of commodities, but it's not that you. I think sometimes people will hear commodities and they will have these preconceived ideas that this is complicated, or I can't begin to know all of that, but to just say one trades commodities and not mention the type of system they use, well, hold on. You don't have a commodities expertise, do you?
No, I have a systems expertise. You are correct. I think the big thing with futures is the leverage. We would say leverage. You'd say leverage. That's a big advantage. Certainly what drew me to it.
Well, talk about that. Talk about why look, because we saw in the financial crisis, there was a lot of leverage that went the wrong way. But leverage is just a tool. Go into some thinking here on your leverage, on why the leverage motivated you. Because, I mean, clearly you can go the other way on leverage too. You could lose it all.
Sure. It's a two-edged sword, as everyone, it's well known it's a two-edged sword. But leverage gives you the advantage to move more size, whether that's in a mechanical sense, you're using a winch to pull your boat in. You could never pull your boat up onto a trailer just by yourself. It would be impossible. So you use a winch, which gives you leverage. Futures are the same, so there's the opportunity for a very large profit. Sadly, there's often not enough of those very large profits. But I think that was the opportunity of those is what drew me into it.
I think one of the things that'd be fun to break down, I saw some research from you. Everybody wants to buy low, sell high, right? This is what everyone wants. This is the panacea, the holy grail, so to speak.
I do too. I never seem to manage it.
Yeah, but you've actually taken this to a fairly kind of really broken it down and done some system testing. And it looks like, just as a side note, it looks like you're a fan of Bob Spear at Mechanica, huh?
Yeah, he's a gem, I think. It's a great program. He's a good guy. And there's not many people out there who write that kind of software who understand much about trading, but Bob is the exception, I think.
Yeah, I had a chance to go over and meet him. We've communicated a lot over the years, but when I was in the East Coast, I went over to Annapolis one day and we had lunch. So I can't say that I've had a chance to go out and see Bob face to face. So
I've been down to his place in Annapolis and we went out for dinner one night, and certainly, worthwhile.
Yeah. Let me take that back, though, as a side note about Bob and his testing software. And as you correctly say, it's one of the best, if not. You have something that you've put together for those that want to think they can buy low and sell high, and you've called it the grab system. Why don't you take as much time as you need to start to walk people through this idea? Because, look, it just seems so simple. Let me find something that's cheap, and then I'll sell it when it gets high. And let me just repeat that process and make it a system. But things don't really work out that way so great, do they?
Not in my experience. I did that work with Ed Dakota, and it was his idea to have a look at something like that, a system that buys low and sells high, i.e. tries to pick market bottoms and tops. And you can find a system that does that for a market or even several markets over a certain period of time, but when you apply that system with the same parameters over 20 markets, say, for 20 years, it just doesn't work. The only way you're going to get that to work is to change the parameters all the time to match the market. Someone out there may be able to do it, but I don't think I can, because you're just pretending that you know what's going to happen, and in my experience, you really don't.
Yeah, because I mean, the idea of buying something cheap, there's so many instances we can all look through the price data that you might want to buy something cheap, but it could just keep going down the other way. In fact, I see this right now with discussions about something as simple as the Shanghai Composite. I mean, the typical people will come on the shows and they'll say, well, it's down 30%. It's a buying opportunity.
Yeah, right. And look, I think a long-term bull market, as we've had in equities, will engender that kind of mentality. After a bear market, no one thinks about that. So part of it is your historical perspective. If you think the market is going up and this is just a blip, you're going to want to buy cheap. But I always looked at this thing as something I was going to do for the rest of my days, and I wanted something that didn't work, not that worked perfectly, but worked consistently. And trying to pick bottoms and tops just doesn't seem to work consistently.
So let me go back in time a little bit before I bring things up to current day. Degree in engineering, as I mentioned, you were in construction, so you're trading from the late 80s to the mid to late 90s for yourself. You decide that you're going to now trade for clients. You're gonna take your insights to the public, so to speak. But you undertook a fairly big event, a fairly big bet on yourself, and you sold something that most people would not think about selling to start a business. Why don't you explain that story?
The big problem with trading futures or any business really is you need capital, and there's no easy way around that in my experience. You can get someone to, in quotes, give you capital, but generally they want a big share of the business if you can convince them to do that. You can maybe get some off your family if they're wealthy, maybe, but I mean, I came to the point where I didn't have enough capital to trade effectively. You need a certain amount to make it all work. And I sold my house. So I was single at the time, so that made it easier. If I was married, I don't think my wife would have let me. It was a huge decision, but I was very confident in what I was doing. Not that I was going to necessarily win, but I knew I wasn't going to lose much because I'd done a lot of work on risk control.
Let's talk about that too. One of the things that you've talked about early on is you were very motivated by, as being in a position, as you just described, not to want to lose money, not having a lot of money. So you are thinking, I need to protect my downside. This way that you've gone about doing it is really built around one key word. And I would love for you to kind of explain that, tear it apart a little bit, but you're a very robust individual in terms of your trading, aren't you?
It's certainly my goal, for sure. You're definitely robust. And again, that comes right back to, I decided this was something I was going to do for the rest of my days. And if you're going to do it for the rest of your days, you've got to be robust because you're going to see good markets and you're going to see bad markets. And I've certainly seen both and expect to see more of both.
Talk about the robust system and the robust approach in the sense, and maybe even define it a little bit for people that are sitting out there. I mean, look, I've got many people in my audience that know exactly what you're talking about, but some new people that probably don't necessarily understand what you mean when you say robust in the context of a trend following system. And to take that one step further, it's really about, you don't want to break. You do not want it to break. So you want to be robust so there's not a breakage.
That was the word I was coming to. You don't want it to break. The key word there is break. Sometimes it will perform poorly, but you don't want it to break down and lose all your money. And risk control is part of that, but also your trading strategy is a big part of that. And that comes right back to what we were just talking about, where you're trying to buy low and sell high. That is not, in my opinion, and as a product of my research, that is not robust. You really need to get aboard and move once it's started rather than trying to pick it, in my opinion.
Look, you're the teacher right now, and you have got a class in front of you, and you're going to start to get, or maybe even you got to give the quick elevator pitch. Break down robust for the audience. What do you mean when you say it in the context of your world?
Robust is something that loses small and wins big. There you go. That's a very basic approach. You're trying to take the big wins. The price for that you pay is losses, but they need to be small. And if you have small losses, you can have a lot of them while you're waiting for the big win.
Why do you have to have any small losses? I'm just being facetious here, but why do you have to have any small losses?
Never know where the market's going. You might have a feeling, you might have an indication, you might even be riding the trend, but it can always turn against you, and often does. And trend following systems invariably have a win-loss ratio less than 50%, often well less than 50%. And I was trying to explain what I do to some friends over the weekend. And I said, my system wins 38% of the time. And I could see them look at me. You can always see their look in their eyes, and they go, this guy's a complete idiot. But I said to them, the important thing is not your win-loss ratio. The important thing is your average win over your average loss. If your average win is much larger than your average loss, you can lose more than half the time and still make money.
That's the magic, or that's one of the magic elements of this. And I'm looking at your stats right now. Your percent wins is 39.9%. Your average wins divided by average loss is 2.64. You basically have big winners and many small losses. And you have those small losses because when you take a bet, when you get a signal in your system or a moment for entry or exit or whatever, you don't know what's going to happen.
Well, generally, often it's wrong. That's probably the safest bet. It's wrong. But you live with that because you know occasionally it's going to be not just right, but very right, if that's using English correctly.
But see, here you are with that type of thinking in so much of the world. I mean, we call this, I think most people would call what you just described, what I'm talking about, is alternative thinking. But so much of the world still today, very bright people, some of them not so bright, really want to think that winning percentage is going to be 100%. I mean, it's almost a delusional type thing where I love when I talk to someone like yourself, you're saying, look, let's just be honest about this. We can't have 100% win rate. So, but it seems like so many people don't want to accept that.
Look, I hope people don't accept it. I mean, I'm being facetious myself, but I mean, I have to make money from someone. That sounds rude. I don't think, I mean, it's counterintuitive. Look, it was counterintuitive for me too. I mean, it's not something that you just come to. It took me a lot of time. And I think it takes, most people who do this, I think it probably takes them a lot of time.
Hold on, you said you were rude that you have to make money from someone. I mean, this is the zero-sum game. This is not rude. This is why the futures markets were put together.
Well, the futures markets were put together for the commercials. But yeah, I mean, we're going in there and taking a speculative risk. That's the other thing I say to people. The futures markets weren't invented for me. They were invented as a business tool for the commercial producers in each commodity or index or interest rate. We just go in and try and find opportunity and provide liquidity. That's our service.
I thought David Drews had a great backstory to how he came about it, and he did not come about it. He started to say, what are all these hedgers doing in this? He was looking at it in an entirely different way. He was more at the level of the futures markets functioning and developing his trend following system from there. And then when it was all said and done, he ended up having a similar approach. Very interesting story there too.
Yeah, and I think anything Dave Drews says or writes is well worth listening or reading or listening to. I haven't met Dave Drews, although I think I said before that my early mentor Rob Holroyd, he was kind of one of his, Dave Drews was his mentor. So I think I got his philosophy by osmosis.
Hey, let me take a side note for a second. You mentioned Ed Secoda and doing this project with him. You know, Ed, I've had a chance to meet Ed several times, and I just think of him as one of the most interesting and perceptive, bright individuals that I've ever had the good fortune to be around. But I think for people that are on the internet and maybe they see a video or they go to his frequently asked questions, they might not necessarily understand the depth. I don't know if there's anything you might want to share or that you can share about your perspective or your feeling about the benefits that you've seen in having interactions with Ed Secoda.
I think there's three things about Ed Secoda which certainly make him unique and an incredibly useful resource, if that's the right word. One is, and I haven't met him, I've done research with him, spoken with him on the phone and stuff, and so we've done some research together. Of the three things, the first thing is he's a tremendously bright guy. I don't think anyone would really question that, and he's got a very inquiring mind. So you've got this very smart guy. That's the first point. The second point is he's tremendously experienced. He started trading futures when? The late 60s, early 70s, so 45 years ago. And he's obviously still doing fine. And you just can't buy that experience, you know. He's seen the boom markets of the 70s, he's seen the bear markets of the 80s, he's seen the tech crash of 2000, he's seen the global financial crisis, he's seen so much, and he's still there. And three, he's sharing this information with you for free. I mean, even if there's other guys out there who are that bright and that experienced, they're not writing a blog on the internet about it. I mean, Ed he gets something out of doing that, maybe because he's giving back or maybe because it helps his own process. I'm not sure, but he's sharing it and it's there for you if you want to go and read it. I mean, you want to do some research with him, you can email in and, you might get to do a project. Amazing.
I think what's interesting too about the way that he presents information, I'm sure a large segment of the audience, like Ed just doesn't spoon feed you, he tells you how it is, and I'm not saying it's a purposeful riddle or a mystery, but I think there's a lot of people that probably read some of the things that Ed says, particularly on his frequently asked questions, and they miss the punchline or they don't get the real point. It just kind of glosses over. I'm sure that happens, and I'm sure it's intentional on his part.
Yes, the stuff there is slightly cryptic, or you could say it's just the really important stuff, but most people don't realize it. And the psychology of trading is tremendously important. And you really only know that once you live it. So I can look at the stuff Ed Sekoda says and I go, yeah, I get what he's talking about because I've been through it. If you're just starting out, it's harder to grasp, definitely, I think.
One of the things when I'm looking at your track record right now, I'm looking at the ups and downs of a robust trend following track record from the late 90s until today, a long stretch. When I see these large up and down moves, I think sometimes people don't quite understand that a good trend following approach is about skill plus opportunity. You can have all the skill in the world, but the markets have to cooperate, don't they?
Sure, you can only take what the market gives you. I mean, as I get older, I look at businesses. I think many businesses are like that. You can be good, and you've got to have the opportunity. And actually, that all comes back to robustness. Because if you're around for long enough, you will get the opportunity. The times are always changing. So if you last long enough, you will live through patches of opportunity. So to do that, you need to be robust.
Do you find it unusual that when you get the question, there's somebody says to you, hey, Mark, I see your performance for 2014. Why is 2015 not as good? It's the funniest thing to me that here so many people out there, they're bright enough to do the homework and they still are stuck in this other land that even when they want to, they could be interviewing you, they could be interviewing David Harding and Ed Sekoda, and they still ask these questions that seemingly that there's no understanding even at a very basic level at all of what you do. If I look at your 2014 performance and I say to you, Mark, why is 2015 not exactly the same? What's your first feeling? I don't even know. Please, can this interview stop now?
Yeah. If you asked me that at the beginning, I'd be going, okay, this could be a long interview. Sure, but you obviously, you understand it. You've just got to say, because it's different, because the markets are different, and we can only take what the markets give us. And I think, often you've said in this interview, you said bright guys don't get it. Trading's not that much about being intellectually bright. It's an emotional thing. It's about learning to live with the emotions of going up and down and learning to do what's counterintuitive. And that's why I think an experienced trader can survive and a lot of people struggle, because that's the hard thing to do. That is, and in my experience. And even once you do it, it's still not that easy to live with. And I suspect you could ask Ed Sekoda, I haven't asked him, but I suspect you could, and say, how do you feel on the losing days? And he'll say, well, I don't really like it that much. Or they're losing months, or they're losing years, for that matter. Those are the ones and they're hard. And it's not just hard for you, it's hard for your wife, it's hard for your family. They think it's easy, and it is easy when you're winning, but it's never easy when you're losing.
One thing that I always like to kind of pick on trend followers about is what you kind of just went on there, which is the scarlet letter of loss, drawdown, and trend following. It's not easy. But on the flip side, if we were to look at some of the classic low volatility superstar traders of the last 20 years, the ones that make you 1% a month for 5 years straight, and then on the first month of the sixth year, they lose all of it. I mean, literally 100%. I think there's a real, and I would love for you to kind of elaborate this, we have this fascination in society about low volatility. Everybody wants low volatility. Give me that standard deviation that doesn't move much from the mean.
I want low volatility as well.
Okay, yeah, but you know you can't get it. So that's, I mean, you know you can't get it, and I'll let you explain it in a second, though. But where I want to go with that is that, so this idea of everybody wanting, or not everybody, but a large number of people wanting low volatility. I mean, the institutional investors, I'm sure they sit down with people like yourself, and that's one of the first things they want to know. But talk about low volatility and risk of ruin. There's a disconnect there that people don't seem to understand, that low volatility does not guarantee you a risk of ruin that's going to be good. I mean, people just miss something there.
Yes, they do, and it's a tricky one to explain. I think, and this sort of analogy I've heard before. I know Dave Drews has used it. Those guys, often those low volatility guys, are picking up pennies in front of steamrollers. Okay, so it works fine until they get their fingers caught, and that's one way of looking at it. Another way I look at it is that we live in a competitive world. Everything involves competition, and that's how the human race gets ahead. No system, no approach will work that well forever, simply because someone else will figure it out, and eventually too many people will be doing it. That's just what happens. So you can have these beautiful approaches that work for a few years, and then either a lot of other people figure it out, so you've got a whole flood of money coming in, the opportunity's gone, or that whole approach was based on a certain set of market conditions, and they change, as they invariably do. So suddenly that approach, which worked so beautifully for a while, maybe it was buying dips in an equity bull run, it's gone. And yet, because your system hasn't thought about that, it hasn't thought about the competition coming in, or it hasn't thought about the market conditions changing, your system is still saying do the same thing, and it can crash. I hope does that give you, is there some insight there? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking to take on the volatility to avoid risk of ruin, which is counterintuitive. You're kind of paying the market and saying, hey, I will take that volatility because I actually feel better about my risk of ruin. Whereas other people say, no, I don't want any volatility, but they're actually perhaps increasing the risk of ruin.
This might seem like a roundabout way of looking at it, but I've thought about this a lot. The volatility makes it very hard to live with. Okay, and I've said that, and I'm sure other traders are going to say the same, and clients will tell you the same thing. And the very fact that it's hard to live with keeps the competition down, and that gives you an edge. The fact that I can keep executing through bad patches time after time, and the only reason I can is because I have complete faith in what I do, and the only reason I have complete faith in what I do is because I've built it, and I've watched it, and I've lived it. So I can keep executing that through the bad patches, and then I pick up the inevitable win. Sometimes it can be a long time coming, but a lot of other people are going to say, oh, here's another take on it. I could give them my system, right? And we come into one of my poor years, 2011, 2012. Halfway through 2011, they're going to say, that Mark, he's quite a bright guy, and he's done quite well, but that system he's got, it's just not working. I think it's rubbish. I'm going to change it. And that's what happens. They change their system. They change the parameters. They change the idea. They decide it's going to be better buying low and selling high. And then you're always fighting the last war. And market conditions change, and you don't make the money back.
It's really about having this depth of understanding over many decades. And so while you mentioned Ed Seykota personally going through those decades of experience, you as a trader using software like Mechanica can actually go back in time and apply your ideas and say, hey, what's the if then? What would have happened? Let's check it out. Let's go back in time. And that gives a lot of confidence.
As long as you make the time frame long enough, you've got to be careful with that, because you could go over the last 4 years and you go, oh, this works great. But then if you find if you test it over the last 30, it doesn't actually work so well. So you just need to be a little careful with that. But yes, certainly if you can test over a long time, over a lot of markets, because then you say, well, this thing, it doesn't work that well all the time, but over a long time period, over all the markets, it works pretty well. And I think Dave Drews has used the analogy, it doesn't fit the markets like a glove, it fits it more like a mitten. There's a bit of room for error in there.
3 different types of trend following time lengths in your approach: medium term, long term, and very long term. I thought it was really interesting. You actually tell you state in some of your materials up to 4 years in a particular trade. That almost feels like buy and hold.
Yeah, it does sometimes too. You can sit through some very big drawdowns in 4 years, but that 4 years is the best trade, right? So that's a market that hasn't actually drawn down too far within the 4 year time period, and you get markets like that. I think that's another advantage that I have over a lot of people, or certainly more short term people. A lot of people don't have the patience to sit with a position for 4 years. And a lot of people also think futures trading is Eddie Murphy or Liar's Poker or something where the guys are in the room yelling and screaming at each other on the phones and they're holding a position for 10 seconds. No, you can do both. And in fact, if you look at the costs of trading, and Ed Sekoda will tell you this, as you go to a longer time period, the fixed costs reduce.
Yeah, I love some of Ed's explanations when people want to trade very short time frames. He's like, hey, why don't we just go for the, some of the speed of light stuff? Why don't we just take it to the fullest extreme? And I think some people still don't get that. Like, hey, I want to be a day trader. I want to trade really short term. And Ed would say, well, hey, come on, just go for the speed of light.
Well, I think what people, and I've thought about this one a lot as well, I'm a price taker, right? I trade the market price that's there in front of me. I have to buy on the bid or sell on the offer. If you're a price taker, you have a certain cost of trading, and that's your slippage plus your commissions. Although your commissions are pretty small nowadays, but the slippage is a big factor. And the more short term you trade, the more times you pay that slippage. It just costs you more and more. If you're a price maker, which that used to be the guys who are the locals on the floor, they're creating the bid and offer, then you probably do want to trade a lot because you're just taking a little bit each time. But as a price taker, which I am, I don't think you want to trade so much.
You're an end of day trader, so you're using end of day data. Do you use any end of week data in your approaches?
No, I don't. But I figure end of day gives you end of week anyway. No, I don't use end of week per se.
The idea of a life. I mean, look, yes, you want to make money. Yes, you're a trader. Yes, you have clients. But, I don't think your idea of a great life would be glued to a screen, becoming a piece of gelatin, sitting in that chair. I mean, we all got to sit in chairs, unfortunately, unless we have standing desks. I miss mine. But talk about the idea of the longer time frame and not, the psychological, the emotional aspects of not being glued to the screen, because so much of the financial world, even the very sophisticated financial world, they're glued to screens during market hours, just watching and attempting to do something in the middle of all of that noise.
I think, well, for a start, you wouldn't want to be doing it in New Zealand because you'd be up all night while the rest of the world was awake. That's the first point. The second point is I think it's a bit like trying to buy low and sell high. People want the short-term fast profit. It just seems to be natural to want that. I don't think trading long-term is I think it's a counterintuitive process. I don't think it's that natural. And again, that's probably what helps make it robust.
That might really get at the point, though, is that just there's so much natural human inclination to just want the quick buck that if you say to yourself, well, if a huge segment of the population wants the quick buck, perhaps if we go over to the other side of the fence, not expecting the quick buck, that perhaps there's some nice opportunity there.
Yeah, that's not exactly how I got there, but having got there and looked at it, I agree. I got there because of this. Basically, my research pushed me that way because of the slippage costs. Also, looking at time frames, I wanted to diversify. So I do go shorter term, but that's not what anyone would call short term because diversification is a really, really big thing. Certainly in what I do, and I think in what most people do. So you can diversify across markets, and I certainly do that as much as I can. And I also try and diversify across time frames as much as I can, with that limit that I don't go too far towards the short term. And one final point with that, I think the quick profit is instant gratification. I think our society likes that, and probably is heading more so that way with the internet. And you can do everything online, bing bang, straight away.
You mentioned diversification. When I see people compare trend following approaches or trend following track records, that's one of the things they miss, isn't it? There's not perfection. People have different portfolios, and the selection of the markets that one trades has a huge effect on the bottom line. So when one is looking at that track record of any trend following strategy, trend following trader, portfolio selection is massive.
Yeah, it's a massive effect. I agree with you. Again, I think just have to look over a long enough time frame so that the ups and downs of that get evened out. Look over the last couple of years, it's too short. Because if I just traded the 3 best markets every year, my returns would be astronomical, but I never know at the beginning of the year what the 3 best markets are going to be.
So no limitations being in New Zealand. You completely have got this all figured out. How many trend following traders are in New Zealand that you know of? You're not the only one, are you? No.
There were a few guys. The hard thing about being in New Zealand is not the technology. There's not a problem there. It's raising assets. Most people who start here and want to raise a lot of money, they go overseas, often to the UK or somewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, because there's just not a big market here. And even though it's easy to email people and stuff and talk to people on the phone, clients want to meet you face to face.
You know, I had just kind of a fun little side story to New Zealand. I had a chance a couple of years ago. I was giving these presentations in Singapore, and this investment bank was kind of shepherding me around for the day. And I ended up in this office, and I didn't know anything about this particular individual. And it was some kind of a penthouse suite office right there on the bay in Singapore. And so I was just a young guy, had invited, I guess this young guy heard I was giving these presentations, and he asked the bank to kind of bring me by. And so we went by and we started chatting, and I walked in, I was like, wow, this place really has some fantastic art. I mean, this is okay. Whoever owns this place, it's one of those feelings you're just like, okay, I've now walked into the room of other money. And this was Richard Chandler's office.
Oh, yes. I certainly don't know him. I've heard of him. Yeah.
I didn't get a chance to meet him. I was just talking to a young guy that worked there that wanted to talk about trend following. But I think what's so great about the world, once one starts to look around and realize how big it is, there is just so much opportunity. There's so many people that have achieved, and it's really fascinating. I mean, I love you're the first person that I've definitely had on my show from New Zealand. So I mean, I just love the idea that we're all connected. There's so many people to learn from. There's opportunity in every country. Every country.
Well, certainly in this business, I mean, I'm just trading the same markets as everyone else does. I mean, that's where the internet makes things easy. There's no problem with the technology. As I say, the problem is with raising assets. And if you want to raise a lot of money, you've got to pick your family up and take them to London, basically. Yeah. From here, probably London or Switzerland or maybe New York.
Well, then you have a quality of life issue too. I mean, let's face it. I mean, if one ends up managing, and sometimes there's a tremendous amount of luck involved, but if one ends up managing multiple billions of dollars of assets of clients, I mean, that's a whole different business. I mean, the freedom quotient goes away there. You have no freedom.
Yeah, certainly. And you have to look at it from that perspective. And it's not I'm not going to end up managing billions of dollars of assets, and it's not my ambition. I enjoy what I do, and I'm keen on the performance. And as you manage too much money, it gets very hard to generate the same kind of performance because you get shut out of a lot of markets. And finally, if you live somewhere with a good lifestyle, and you look at the issue of going away to manage a lot of money somewhere else, you're probably going to do that to manage the money, to make the money, then to come back here to live anyway.
Yes, you're already there, so you're like, okay, let's just keep what I've got, the good stuff right now.
Yeah, trust me, I go through that thought many times a week. Should I be here? Should I be in Europe? But I'm here, and this is what I enjoy. And my family's here, and yeah. And as I say, from a trading perspective, it's fine. Yeah. It's only the asset raising perspective is hard.
Well, I've spent a lot of time in Asia in the last couple of years, calling you from Asia right now, so I'm going to have to make it down into New Zealand. I know I think it's about a 12-hour flight from where I'm at, so you are really not close to anybody. But
it's a long way from anywhere. People say, I'll go to Singapore, and then it's another 12 hours to New Zealand. They go, what?
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I was just thinking that too. I was thinking, okay, yeah, maybe Mark's been to Singapore a bunch, but 12 hours, that's like me flying back to the States.
Well, actually, I've traveled more to the US than I have to have through Asia. But yeah, it's a 12-hour hop from here to LA, and you look out the window and you see Auckland disappear, and it's ocean for the next 11 hours and 45 minutes until you see Catalina Island. The Pacific is a big ocean, and we're down the bottom.
Hey, Mark, where's the best place we can send people to check your firm out, MS Capital Management Ltd? Where can we send people to check you out?
the website, www.mscapmgmt.com. If it's too hard to spell that, just Google Mark Sleeman Futures and you'll get there pretty fast.
Sleeman.
Correct. Thank you. Yes, Mark Sleeman.
Okay. Cool. Absolutely. Fun stuff. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for calling. A lovely time chatting. If you ever come down to New Zealand, tell me you're coming and I'll come and take you out for lunch or show you where to go. There's some lovely places to see down here.
Yeah, some of the pictures I see, I just have a feeling there's some nature shots and vistas in New Zealand that probably don't exist anywhere else in the world. So I definitely have to see some of that before I leave the planet.
Oh, look, it's people who come here. I'm going to do a bit of a New Zealand tourism plug here, but certainly people who come here, they love it. Look, the country is about the same size as Japan and 4 million people live here, so there's plenty of free space.
Wow.
The scenery is great. Good skiing, not bad surfing.
Same size as Japan, 4 million people. That's amazing.
Yeah, so it's and if you come down here, you've got to go to Australia as well, which is it's a fascinating country as well, and they're both pretty much next to each other.
Mark, thank you, sir. Hopefully we talk again in the future when, if we go by Ed's Gavopoly, and there could be big stuff ahead in the future. And if there's big stuff ahead in the future, I'm sure markets will go in all kinds of large, unexpected moves, and that will make for some interesting banter, I'm sure.
I think there's certainly a chance of that happening.
I love skepticism. I'm one of the biggest skeptics. I mean, I know there's all kinds of funny business that goes on in the government. Look at the U.S. Federal Reserve. How much funny business went on in 2008, 2009. So I get being a skeptic. I understand. But once I know the story, and once the data matches the story, I'm not a skeptic. My second book was called The Complete Turtle Trader, about a very famous story of a man named Richard Dennis and his partner Bill Eckhart, how they took essentially non-experienced traders off the street, taught them to be trend-following traders, and it worked. In 1988, these students, nicknamed the Turtles, went off on their own. Now, all these years later, many of them are still trading today for clients. The cool thing is the experiment never ended. The trading never stopped. And it wasn't just the turtle traders, the trend-following turtle traders. So many other trend-following traders across the world have kept the so-called experiment going. Whether they were turtles or inspired by the turtles or never heard of the turtles, trend following has become accepted by those at least that have a pulse, those that have some intelligence. Maybe that makes it a fairly small minority still. Nonetheless, the turtle trader story was just fantastic. Nurture trumping nature. Teaching trend following, showing that trend following worked. It did, and it does. A skeptic reached out to me the other day, though, and they said, you used an example of Google in your book on the turtles. Well, that's wrong, because Google was not around then. So, if you make up something about Google, what else are you making up? Now, of course, he said that one example was most likely used by me to just show a current market, of course. The universality of trend following is what I was really showing. It didn't make a difference what one was trading in 1982, 83, 84, or today. As long as the market is liquid, as long as it trends, trend following works. So he fixated on that one thing, that Google was used as an example, and everything else in the book was invalidated because of that one issue. Now, that's no longer a skeptic. That's just crazy town. Now, that's fine. I welcome the crazy town listeners to my podcast. That's great. It gives me something to talk about. It gives me something to rile against. So for that, I'm fortunate. Yes, the book, The Complete Turtle Trader, my second book, is invalidated because one of the market examples used included Google. Today in the podcast, I have Brian Proctor. Brian is a managing director at EMC Capital. EMC Capital was started by Elizabeth Cheval. Now, unfortunately, Elizabeth is no longer with us, but she was one of the original turtles. So Elizabeth's track record starts in 1985, continues with her firm EMC, and EMC continues to this day. Brian was also an original turtle in the Richard Dennis experiment. He joined Elizabeth at EMC after the firm was started, and to this day, he continues to help lead EMC as one of the original turtle traders taught by Richard Dennis. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Brian Proctor. Brian, Mike Covel.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
Not too bad. Not too bad.
You get up early. You sent me an email at 4:00 in the morning.
Well, I'm in Saigon.
Oh, you are? Okay.
So the real question might be, who was getting up early?
Well, I got up at 6, and I looked, and I'm like, I got an email 2 hours ago. I'm like, holy cow.
You're like, oh, wow, this guy's really off his rocker.
What's going on in Saigon?
Let's see. I've been doing this podcast for 3 years, and I've been in and out of Southeast Asia since early 2013. I came here on a speaking tour. I was living in San Diego, and then one thing led to another, and I said, wow, this is kind of a cool place. I can stay here. So now I do all these crazy podcast episodes from Southeast Asia, huh?
Wow. Okay.
Hey, I was trying to think when we met, and I was writing it down. I think it was June of 2010 in Chicago at an MFA meeting, if I'm not mistaken.
I think you're right. I think we met because we were listening to a panel that had my old boss, Rich Dennis, and some of the guys and girls that I knew very well up to talk about their experiences with the mentoring program that Rich ran.
Yeah, well, obviously, and you were a part of that too. But let me jump in. So, as a managing director of EMC right now, commodity trading advisor, managed futures player, long track record back to 1985. And since you just kind of brought it up, I think it'd be a good thing to start with the audience, and then we'll kind of bring things forward to today, because it is one fascinating, and I'm sure there's probably a side of you that's like, oh my gosh, I don't want to have to say anything anymore, but it's still so fascinating to people out there to realize. And I guess for you, maybe it feels like a long ago school program, but it just so happens to have been a school program that was a very successful one. Why don't you talk about, Brian, I'm really curious, your first trading moments, how you got started and what led you to the Turtle program?
You know, like Rich Dennis, I grew up on the south side of Chicago. So when I graduated from college in 1982 with a degree in economics, I went out and there was a big recession going on, and I thought I was going to get into investment banking somehow. But as I soon found out, they were laying more people off in the banking industry in Chicago than hiring. So just by chance, I ended up playing a round of golf, and in my foursome was a guy named Everett Klipp who ran Alpha Futures, a big FCM, a big clearing member at the Board of Trade, where a lot of locals would clear their trades. As I played with Everett that day, he was asking me what I was going to do with my life, and I wasn't really sure, and I asked him what he did, and he started to tell me about the trading in the pits of Chicago, and I had heard about it but never seen him before. So, I bugged him a little bit, and I said, I'd like to come down and see how everything works down there, and if, maybe find a job down there. And he tried to dissuade me from coming into the business. He goes, no, you don't want to get in this business. It's a bad business to get into. Lots of people start in this business. They lose money. I wouldn't suggest it. So he kind of put me off. But I wouldn't take no for an answer, so I kept calling him, and finally invited me down to his office and showed me around and took me down to the floor, which was a tremendous experience. I'd never seen it before, and the minute I walked down the floor, I realized this is what I wanted to do. It was just that overwhelming. And so Everett, God bless him, he was a great guy. He took me under his wing, and he said, I think I can help you find a job. And there was a new firm starting up. The name of the firm was C&D Commodities. It was two guys, very famous locals down in the grain room primarily, Larry Carroll and Rich Dennis. And they were just opening a brand new firm, and Everett got me an interview at C&D, and I was probably, I want to say, maybe the fifth person they hired there as they were starting their new firm. So I got thrown right into the fire from the very beginning and worked on, started as basically a runner, phone clerk on the floor of the Merc first in the old black box when the Merc was, in its infancy. And then worked there for a while, and then moved over to the Board of Trade and kind of climbed the ladder at C&D pretty quickly, just because I'd gotten in the door first. So it was just a good stroke of fortune for me to have that opportunity, and I learned a lot. There were guys on the floor running the show for Rich Dennis, Danny Smith, Jack Callahan. Those guys, always at work every morning, 5 o'clock, ready to go, great work ethic, and set a great tone and a great example for me. So I lucked out. So I got into the turtle program really. I was running the floor operation in the grain room for Rich when he first decided to start this program, and he put the ad in the Wall Street Journal, and we'd come upstairs after the trading day was done, and there would be literally, gigantic bags, sacks from the U.S. Post Office in our office, and we'd have to kind of weed through the mail and sort it, and Rich and Bill Eckhart and some of the other guys up in the office would weed through these. And so, I witnessed the first round of turtles, if you will, that came in, and saw how successful they were. Over the course of the next year, Rich decided he was going to open it up and do one more round and bring in another, half dozen to 10 more traders into the program because it was doing so well. So it was at that point when I went to him and I said, look, what's my career path at C&D going to be here? Am I going to be, go into the pit and get a badge and execute trades for you, or with this turtle program, would I be a candidate? And, what would you suggest if you were me? And Rich said, you can skip the floor, because even if you get a badge and you go into the pits, you're going to get tired of that mentally and physically, after 5-10 years. So why don't you just skip that phase and go right off the floor and start to learn how to trade off the floor? So that made it easy for me. I said, well, if you would consider me for the turtle program, the second round here, why don't I make that move? I didn't have to go through, per se, the big, long interview process and answer. Well, I guess I did answer the questionnaires that he put out there. Anyway, that's how I got my start in the business. It was just kind of a stroke of luck that, ended up being in the right place at the right time. And, obviously the turtle program and the opportunity that Rich afforded all of us was an incredible opportunity. It gave you the chance to learn how to trade and take the emotion out of it, because it wasn't your money. It was Rich's money. As you know, that we used a high degree of leverage in the turtle program. So the opportunity to make triple-digit returns was there. Where our margin to equity was very high.
I'm looking at your returns that I jotted down for while you were in the program. 85, 55%, 86, 116%. In 1987, you had the highest return of any of the turtles in the program as 185%. So yeah, you're right. You guys were shooting for big returns at the time.
Well, I actually, in 1987, I lucked out a little bit, just because at the time I was, at the time, a little bit before I started the turtle program, I decided that since the trading day back in when I started on the floor, we worked from 7. Well, actually, we got in the office around 5, but the trading day would be done by, if you worked in the grain room, you were off the floor by 1:30. If you worked in the bond room, you were off by 2 o'clock. So I decided to go to law school down the street at John Marshall and get a law degree in the evenings. So I had a little time to study and then go to class. So I actually was literally the week and the days leading up to the 87 crash, I was taking finals in law school, and rather than worry about a lot of positions in my portfolio, doing my homework and working on the trading levels and stuff, I took a lot of my positions off or scaled back a lot of the positions going into my finals week in law school. When 87 happened and there was, a big disruption in the market, especially in the short-term interest rates and currencies, besides the equity market, I had very little exposure on, so I didn't take the gigantic hit that a lot of the other guys in the Turtle program. So that was a stroke of luck, actually. It had nothing to do with my exceptional brilliance or anything in that particular year.
Let me talk about one aspect of the program that I think is interesting and comes up to modern day a little bit. I think there's been a couple, I don't want to call them experiments, but some people that witnessed from afar the Turtle program and they wanted to replicate it. I think there was a British guy that was going to teach day trading to somebody or some group of people. But I think what people sometimes forget is that this program, depending on whether you came in the first year or the second year, was 4 years and 3 years. So this was a lot of time. And, I think people want to think that there's something to film. There's some sexiness to it. But, having a good strategy and sticking with it and having the discipline to stick to that strategy doesn't mean that there's a bunch of people in a room jumping up and down like the trading floor. And I think still to this day, people want to imagine some physical activity. And whereas I think you'll probably have added this, it's more of a cerebral game.
Definitely. I mean, it's, there's a lot of, when you're building systematic trading models, when you have, the blend of systems and you have your risk management parameters preset, then it's really, there's not a whole lot of excitement. You have some busy days, and in the old days we used to be on the phone a lot. You'd have to call the floor, you'd have to call, the sugar, the people in the softs pit, or you'd have to call the crude oil or at the board or the Merc. So you had a lot of phone calls to make trades when there was a big burst of activity, but a lot of time, there's just a lot of downtime so you could spend that time, either looking at new ideas or trying to test new ideas or, doing homework in some other area. So you're right. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of activity or emotion, when the time came, having a disciplined approach. Actually, that was the hardest part, was to just have the discipline to do what the system, when the signals are generated. Sometimes it was counterintuitive. You'd look at it and say, I really don't want to buy the market up here. I don't want to sell this. I remember being short crude and taking a short position at below $10 a barrel back in, I think it was 87. So, that probably was the hardest part about what we had to do was taking some of these trades that were very difficult. And Rich always said, doing the hard thing is when you do the easy thing, you're probably going to lose. You do the hard thing, and it's probably going to turn out okay. That
confidence that was instilled at you at a young age, that's something that's never wavered. I mean, for example, in the last 3, 4, 5 years, it's been the latest rounds of systematic trend following CTA style trading is dead. Now, from your perspective, going back to the early 80s, I'm curious, how do you feel when you see these stories? Because you're looking at the markets and systems from a much different perspective than what people that are not familiar with your style of trading. They see the headlines and they get excited by the headlines. But from a confidence perspective, really well deep in your gut, those headlines don't really amount to anything. It's all about the system, the rules, sticking with it.
Absolutely. That was, Rich said the two most important things you can learn from this program are, number one, you have to be very disciplined, manage your risk, take your losses, have an unwavering discipline when it comes to that. And the second most important thing is, when you're doing your testing and you're coming up with new trading ideas, new trading models, to just have some very robust parameters out there to make these systems operate. Honestly, I mean, our best systems now, if you have a system that has a 40% winning percentage over a long period of time across all the markets we trade, that's a phenomenal system. And so what that tells you is you're going to have more losing trades than winning trades. The discipline of letting your winning trades run and cutting your losses is where you make your money. It sounds simple, and you hear a lot of people say it, but the truth is it can be a very difficult thing to do month after month, year after year. So when we do go through difficult periods for our particular style of trading, such as after '08 up until 2013, we had an up year, down year, down year, up year. We kind of went sideways to negative for quite a long time, the longest period I can remember in this business. And it would have been easy to kind of say, maybe our models are broken. Let's change things and let's move to, let's do things differently. And we at EMC decided, not to do that, we've seen these kind of periods before. You never know when the next successful period is going to come for our style. The financial engineering that was going on around the world, the central banks and the governments of the world propping up asset classes and trying to control interest rates and currency flows and things. They were obviously very successful at that, which made it difficult for us. But, we'd see little glimmers of hope of markets starting to diverge and follow their own kind of supply and demand, or, the other fundamentals that normally drive markets. And so we were cautiously optimistic that at some point, the long sideways to negative performance would end. And of course it did over the last, for us over the last 12 months. It's been, in our classic program, close to 40% over that time period. That's just the nature of our return stream. And if your investors understand that and they're comfortable with it and they know it's a long-term investment, they're going to understand we're going to have periods where performance is going to be difficult, but as long as you have long-term positive expectation, the benefits, obviously the non-correlative benefits of adding us to an investment portfolio really make it worthwhile for investors.
Brian, EMC Capital was started by a fellow turtle, Liz Cheval. She's unfortunately no longer with us, but I'm curious if you might go back and give some perspective about working with her, what she's instilled in the firm that to this day is still an integral part of EMC.
Sure. I mean, she obviously, we were friends way back in the early days, and we got to trade in the same room together and get to know each other. And she was always, a pleasure and a really a wonderful person. Over the years, after the Turtle program ended and everybody went out on their own, Liz formed EMC. Through her perseverance and her personality and her intellect, she partnered up with a couple of very good partners in this business, that being Dearborn Capital Management and Morgan Stanley. She cultivated those relationships very well over time, in addition to having great performance for them. Her ability to run a business as well as be a successful trader was, it's just a testament that EMC is still running here, even though she's passed now for 2 years. All those values were instilled in the people here at EMC. I've been here for 10 years, so I went off and did my own thing. I ran a CTA for a while. I went back and ran Rich's trading operation for a while. I moved to New York and traded for a hedge fund, a long-short equity firm for a while, and then came back to Chicago, met up with Liz, talked about our business, I ended up here, which was very fortunate. The carryover from the lessons that Rich and Bill instilled in us, still the same basic philosophy. You're looking to continuously look to improve your trading models or build new trading models that complement the ones in the portfolio. So it's an ongoing discipline of continuous research, using the advances in technology to your benefit. So now we've reinvested enormous sums of money back into our infrastructure here in terms of research and trading, so that we're at the forefront of quantitative analysis here, and then to have the discipline to build systems based on trend following and momentum. It's always about directional price movement. It's never about trying to pick tops or bottoms, and then implementing them in a way that you spread the risk out across the markets and the systems that you trade. Get as much diversification as you can and manage your risk. It's really all about having a big database across numerous markets, lots of data points, daily data for 80 markets looking back, 20 years. So it's how do you efficiently and with a certain degree of speed, how do you look at all those possible variables when you're building a trading model that might have anywhere from, say, 8 to 13 parameters, the parameters being the type of price action that gives you initiation signals, the type of price action that gives you how to liquidate those trades, and then there'll be filters, there'll be filters in there that deal with things like volatility or delays or things like that. So, when you're optimizing a trading system using this newer technology, what it basically allows you to do is open your parameter sets much wider than you would have been able to in the older days when you did a lot of this by hand and then went back to the machine and had them rerun. So the biggest benefit is opening up the parameter sets and allowing the speed of the computers to just do multiple iterations, just millions of tests. It's a natural progression of the best parameters in the trading model rising to the cream rises to the top, and that's how you optimize your trading system. Obviously you have to be aware of possible pitfalls that come with curve fitting. To get around that, you don't optimize to one metric. You use a blend of metrics, and by that I mean you can mix a return element with another concept such as efficiency or Sortino or something like that. That's one way to prevent curve fitting. Another way is to obviously create an out-of-sample hypothetical return set and then compare that to what you actually were producing when you're re-optimizing existing systems or building new systems to see if actual trading mimics your hypothetical returns.
There still seems to be a significant number of traders, your firm included, though, that do have core trend or systematic approaches, trend following type approaches. And do you ever find it kind of amazing when you look back and you say, wow, some of these men that I learned from all these decades ago, and look, Richard Donchian before Rich and Bill and some of the other guys in the 70s, it's amazing that these core philosophies and many core strategies have continued to excel.
It's just a testament, I guess, to human nature. Markets are not always rational. They're not always efficient. On top of that, there really are things that drive markets besides human emotions, whether it be supply and demand or changes in technology or geopolitical events or some kind of economic upheaval. When those happen, a divergent strategy like ours, the assets are going to be mispriced across the board. There's going to be some sharp money flows in response to the mispricing of assets. The efficient market, when things are status quo and 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 the world is not in upheaval, then, you're going to have slow, steady, progressing markets. Over time, from, one decade to the next, there's always the unforeseen, the unexpected, the sea change in one asset class or a number of asset classes that people have to react to, and you get long, pronounced trends. If you have systems in place that are designed to capture those, and you have the discipline to, say, get short crude oil at $100 a barrel, if it goes down to $80, a discretionary trader may, if there's a little bit of consolidation there, decide to take the position off, and then it may gap down $2 the next day, and it makes it hard to reinitiate a position the next day unless you have that mentality that, this trend could continue much further than, I envision right now. Yeah, it's amazing that these programs, that, the old guys, the pioneers in our business envisioned working and experienced, they really understood the nature of the markets, and that there will be great profit opportunities in a wide variety of markets if you have the discipline to do it the right way.
They're not going to hand out the Nobel Prizes to traders anytime soon, I don't think. But all of the guys that get these Nobel Prizes, and some of them are extremely brilliant, I'm not taking anything away from them, but it seems like some of the traders that actually figured out all their lessons that they got the Nobel Prizes for long time ago already in the markets, in the pits, etc.
Yeah. Well, I think if you asked Rich or any of us, we're not anywhere close to being that deep of thinkers or that much in academia. It's just kind of a learning experience.
But it's the results.
It's more of putting your nose to the grindstone and doing the right thing day after day than coming up with some world changing.
Let me ask you about diversification. I received an email the other day, and somebody was asking me about the Swiss franc move in January. And I've talked about this in my podcast before. Other people have commented on it. And this person wrote me, they said, I don't understand these strategies, the quant trend type strategies. If they're trading the Swiss franc in January, how do they not lose 30 or 50%? And I think what people don't get is that, and I want you to comment on this and talk about this, is that you're not betting the ranch on each market. That's number one. And then number two, if you do happen to have losses, which you're going to have, there's also going to sometimes be gains, and the gains can offset the losses. Why don't you talk about that? Because I think that's a big picture concept that you might even face with. I mean, these days, I'm sure many of your clients get what you guys do, but still, there's going to be very bright, very wealthy people that still might not appreciate this idea that, well, we didn't get blown out on the Swiss franc because our position size was such that we weren't going to. And then number two, our other gains can offset. What do you talk about that, Brian?
Sure. Well, there was that was kind of a unique situation because of the peg that the Swiss National Bank had put into place. And once it got below that peg, and there were traders out there, certainly discretionary traders, who looked at it and said, what's the risk here? We got the ECB about a month away from their new QE program, if you will. So there were guys who looked at that and said, something could happen with the peg here. I'm not comfortable with this position, and just took it off. We didn't do that. We were still short the Swiss franc, but as you said, every trade that we take, there's a limit to the amount of risk that we'll put in any one trade, in any one market, in any one sector. The risk of ruin gets greatly reduced as you spread the risk out across 80 some odd markets across the globe. The Swiss franc only is going to get a certain small percentage of the total risk in the portfolio. Now, that said, for us, on the day of the decision to remove the peg, we were short. We lost a little over 2% in the Swiss franc that day, but at the same time, you have to remember we were long the Euro Swiss, which was the interest rate component of that. So the Euro Swiss actually that day and then for the ensuing week after that had a tremendous rally as the short-term rates went further into negative territory. So, we had the diversification to offset a lot of the loss that we took in the Swiss franc that day with some of the interest rate exposure we had there, plus being long the DAX, which has gone up about 25% since January, because of this QE program and because of what's going on over in Europe with, the attempts to stimulate their economy. The diversification really does play a role. The limit of risk in each market and in each sector that we trade plays a role. We've seen currencies go through pegs before, and we've seen, banks and central banks and other entities, say one thing and do another thing. So we really can't base any of our trading decisions on what, might happen or might not happen. Our models are really designed to react to what's going on in the marketplace rather than try to be predictive.
I have this jotted down in my notes here, quote, every now and then the impossible can and will happen, end quote. And it's such a simple thought, but how many of us go wrong on that, huh?
Yeah, I mean, every now and then you do get something that just defies logic. I wouldn't say this defied logic. It was just an event that, in retrospect, you can look back and say, oh yeah, we should have seen that coming, or oh, that would have been really easy to predict. But the reality is, in the moment, as you're looking at it, you don't know what's going to happen. And the Swiss obviously are very good at being secretive about what what they do. So, for us, it's responding to things that happen in the market rather than trying to predict the next black swan or trying to imagine the next gigantic price move in some market. You just have no idea.
I did not ask anything in the beginning of our conversation today, but I'm curious, looking back in time, how were you influenced by Bill Eckhart?
By Bill Eckhart? Well, Bill, was kind of the quant of the duo of Rich and Bill. I think Rich was the more intuitive trader, started in the pits and had a knack, obviously, for assessing situations and was comfortable taking risk and managing that risk, and obviously built a fortune. He recognized the brilliance of Bill and his mathematical approach to trading, and so it was a good partnership for them. You had the intuitive ideas that could be, or at least attempt to put those ideas into mathematical equations. And so it was really, I think their partnership was great, in that each one of them kind of had a unique contribution to the overall success of their partnership and of the Turtle program in general.
Yeah, I think we can all, maybe people aren't going to agree with me, but I don't think there's ever going to be a repeat of that particular event. I think the fact that it happened before the internet, where everybody wants cameras everywhere today and all that kind of stuff, I think it's just this naturally occurring event, seminar type program put in place by two men behind the scenes. And then when it was over, everyone learned of it and learned of the success. But I think it's going to be something where even 50 years from now, 100 years from now, people are going to look back and go, that was a really cool thing.
Well, being a part of it was definitely, the changing point of my life. So personally, I owe those two guys, really everything that I have right now. Is they put the programs in place and taught me some invaluable lessons and how to think about things and how to look at things. And so you're right. I don't know if there'll ever be anything quite like it. There might be something cooler that happens, honestly, in the next 10 years. For me, just being a part of it, with the friendships, I still see a lot of the guys out there, not as much as I used to, but we keep in touch, and they're, obviously everybody's program has evolved and changed over the years to one degree or another. I think, it's, just the nature of the business is how you're going to, or I guess the nature of our business, how you're going to position yourself, what kind of products are you going to build and offer in the marketplace. So, we're the sub-advisor of a multi-strategy 40 Act fund now. If you would have floated that by me, 5-10 years ago, we would have said there's no way we'll ever be part of a mutual fund offering. You just, you never know. Your business models and investor appetites ebb and flow and change over time. If you have a nice suite of products, if you will, that you can offer them, we kind of have a little something for everybody here, I think.
I'll leave you with this. I saw a comment recently and from one of your turtle peers, and essentially said, hey, before we rule active strategies out, before we say that they're no longer valid, let's let the equity bull come down a little first. So I think it's interesting that even given the massive equity bull of the last 4, 5, 6 years, it's amazing to look at the performance from a lot of trend quant strategies, especially in 2014. Not everything goes up. I think it's going to be really interesting to see as the years unfold. And this is not a prediction or anything. I have no crystal ball, but I think everybody with a pulse out there knows that your type of strategies do extremely well when turbulence appears.
Well, historically we have, and I hope that proves to be true when the great unwinding begins to happen here. And honestly, it's impossible to decipher how it's going to unfold. Whether, when the bond rally finally ends, how it's going to end, why it's going to end. The equities will probably have an adverse reaction when that's happening. So it's going to be, we haven't been here before. So really, it's anybody's guess how it's going to, anybody can say it's going to end badly, but maybe it won't end badly. Maybe it'll be a smooth unwinding. Maybe it'll be, it'll just be markets will kind of go back to normal, and it's impossible to tell, honestly.
Your strategies will go either way, though.
Exactly. I mean, if there are money flows out of bonds and into other asset classes, we will be selling bonds and buying those other asset classes. Or, if the equity world gives back some of these extraordinary gains that they've built up over the last few years, then we'll be short in the equity markets and profit from whether it's a relatively short downturn or a more steep, dramatic downturn. You're right. I mean, we're positioned, and our models are nimble enough to be able to turn and profit from any directional price movement in any market.
Brian, I can't keep you. I'd love to have you on again. Where's the best place we can send the audience to check you and your firm EMC Capital out?
Our website is www.emccta.com. And then, there'll be some information on our firm, our programs, and a way to contact me if you'd be interested in talking about our programs in more detail.
Brian, I appreciate you taking the time today. How's Chicago weather this morning?
Well, it got cold finally, but when I was walking the dog last night at 7 o'clock, it was 70-something degrees. When I walked the dog one more time at 10 o'clock last night, it was 50 degrees, and now it's in the 30s. So we're getting a little blast of cold, but, spring's right around the corner now.
Well, the next time you stop by Southeast Asia, I can give you a little dose of not cold.
Last time I was in Singapore, it was like 90% humidity in the mid 90s, and I thought, oh my God, I couldn't live in this. Walking down the street, I was drenched in sweat within 5 minutes. I
mean, the only thing I could wear are t-shirts. I mean, I can't. If I put a long sleeve shirt on, I'm dripping. Hey, listen, Brian, okay. Thank you for joining me. Take care.
Yep, Michael, thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend Following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.